Section 11 of The Diamond Lens with Other Stories by Fitz James O'Brien. LibriVox recordings in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Duke Humphrey's Dinner. Footnote. O'Brien wrote a little comedy on the same subject treated in this story, which was produced at Wallack's Theatre February 4th, 1856, with Mr. Lester Wallack as Berdoon and Mrs. Hoy as Agnes. Editor. In footnote. Have we no more coal, Agnes?
No more.
What the deuce are we going to do for fire?
I haven't the slightest idea, Dick. You're clever. Why don't you invent some way of warming oneself without the aid of fire?
If you were a man, I could box with you, said Dick, looking meditatively at his wife as if wondering whether she could stand a round or two. Boxing warms one up famously, but then we have no gloves.
No, said Agnes with a laugh, and we shall have no shoes either in a very short time.
And she pushed out as she spoke a little foot with a dilapidated slipper on it. What a funny thing it is to have no money, Agnes, said Dick, gazing at a very small fire which smoldered in the grate with a rather contemplative air. Do you know that if it wasn't so confoundedly cold, I'd rather enjoy poverty? Now in the summer-time there must be something very piquant in misery.
Only to think, answered Agnes, of the thousands of dollars that I've thrown away on follies, when 1/10 part of the sum would be a perfect dream of happiness now.
At present, $5 would present as magnificent an appearance as the English national debt in gold sovereigns.
Do you remember the ball at which you first proposed to me, Dick?
Don't I?
The large, lofty rooms glowing with burnished gold and soft lights, the carpets with their elastic mossy pile, into which one's feet sank so far and so pleasantly that they became loath to leave their nests, making one lounge lazily instead of walking. The conservatory, dimly lit with colored lamps, where tropical leaves nodded heavily, as if bathed in eastern dreams, and the rich scent of the tube roses wandered through the trees like the souls of dead flowers, roaming in search of some bloomy paradise. The music streaming through the wide doors of the dancing rooms and quivering off into the distance. The rustle of rich silks, the murmur of the thousand voices, the light, the perfume, the glory of youth and joy, spreading over everything like an atmosphere of human sunshine, which myriads of gay and splendid butterflies floated. Don't you remember, Dick?
I do, answered Dick, with rather a sad smile and a glance round the wretched room in which they were sitting. I remember well the glories of the life in which you were born, and the contrast, strange enough, with the life to which I have brought you. You have described the past, let me describe the present. A 4th-story room in a tumble-down tenement house in the filthiest part of Mulberry Street. German shoemakers and Irish washerwomen above and below us. No furniture save a table and a pallet bed. A couple of old wine boxes to sit on in place of chairs. 2 feet of snow on the ground and no coal. An exceedingly healthy and promising hunger gnawing at both of us, and no money to buy food. All our available goods sold or pawned long ago. Repudiated by our relatives because we chose to marry each other on the ridiculous basis of mutual affection, all our efforts to obtain work being constantly frustrated by either Providence or his satanic majesty. Just enough of inconvenient pride left in us to prevent us from begging. And I think, my dear Agnes, you have as pretty a case for suicide as ever came up in evidence before a Paris police court. Don't you feel like a pan of charcoal in a last embrace? Or a dose of strychnine and a despairing letter to our friends? I would offer you a pair of pistols and a mutual shooting arrangement, but at present my account at the Merchant's Bank is rather confused, and I do not like to draw a check for any amount until it is settled. And the young husband laughed as heartily as if the whole thing were a sort of comedy which he was rehearsing, and which he thought he was doing exceedingly well.
Dick,
said his wife very earnestly, coming round to where her husband sat, and kissing him gently on the forehead.
Dick, you are jesting, are you not? You have no such ideas, I trust.
Jesting? Of course I am, you dear little puss. Of all the unphilosophical things a man can do, killing himself is about the most unphilosophical. To kill another man is unphilosophical because the chances are 10 to 1 that the murder will be discovered, and the perpetrator hanged. Therefore, murder is only a devious way of committing suicide, with the additional disadvantage of having killed a fellow creature. But as far as regards the individual, suicide is still more unphilosophical than murder, for you do not allow yourself even a chance of escape. We may have to die of starvation, my dear little mentor, though I think it unlikely. If we have, however, the best thing we can do is to use all the means in our power to avert the unpleasant occurrence, and if it comes, meet it manfully. You may say womanfully if you choose. But if we were to kill ourselves by poison in order to avoid dying 20 hours later of starvation, don't you think we should be doing rather an absurd thing? Particularly if, after we were dead, our spirits discovered that Providence would have sent us at the 19th hour some guardian angel in shape of a friend who would have relieved us from all our misery. No, my dear, we won't have any prussic acid or French exits from life. When we are too weak to stand up, we will lie down side by side. And when we are too exhausted to live, we will clasp our hands together, bless God with our last breath, and die like the babes in the wood. Perhaps after we are dead, that Irish washerwoman who lives in the 5th story may come in, like the robin in the legend, and cover us with leaves. She isn't very like a robin, certainly, continued Dick with an air of mock meditation, for she swears frightfully, and I regret to say smells of whiskey. This struck the pair as so very comic an idea that they simultaneously clapped their hands and burst into peals of laughter. To hear those shrieks of merriment, one would have thought this young couple the blithest and most careless creatures in the world. Their history was a simple romance. They were both orphans, the only difference being that Agnes Grey was an orphan with rich relatives, and Richard Burdoon an orphan with no relatives at all. Agnes had been adopted by her uncle, an old bachelor who lived in Boston, a selfish old man who, once he took possession of the poor girl, looked on her as his personal property, and regarded all who would seek to deprive him of her as atrocious burglars, worthy of the extremest penalties of the law. He petted her then as Caligula petted his favorite horse. She was clothed in purple and fine linen, and had her gilded stable. Agnes Grey had but to express a desire, and every luxury that wealth could purchase dropped at her feet from the hands of the abominable old fairy, her uncle. She gave balls and matinees, and rode on Arab steeds. Her jewels were the newest and the most wonderful, her dresses unimaginably well-fitting. Having wealth, beauty, and an indulgent guardian, this charming young girl wanted but one thing, a lover. It is a curious dispensation of Providence that while some young ladies are all their lives waiting for lovers, that commodity never arrives, whereas others have scarce begun to feel the vague desire. When, lo, it rains and hails and snows any quantity of adoring young gentlemen. Agnes Grey, then, had scarcely conjured up the youngest of desires in her most secret heart, when the wall opened and Mr. Richard Burdoon, stepping out, proclaimed himself her lover. I don't mean to say that the wall opened in reality, but it is a metaphorical way I have of expressing that he arrived in the nick of time. They met at a party. Mr. Burdoon, having been left a few $1,000s just 1 year previously by the death of his only surviving relative, set off for Europe to spend them. He succeeded to admiration, and, at the time I speak of, had just returned with an immense deal of useless experience and just $350. Considering very properly that so enormous a capital justified any folly, he ran off with Miss Agnes Grey without consulting her avuncular dragon. That jealous old relative, wounded in his tenderest spot, raged like a fury, disowned his unhappy niece, and swore a solemn oath that he would let her die of starvation ere he would assist her. At first Agnes and her husband mentally whistled at his threats. Had they not $350? Armed with so incalculable a sum, what cared they for poverty? They came to New York. Ah, how quickly did the scenes in the panorama succeed each other! Metropolitan Hotel and fine apartments, then boarding-house, and sudden departure therefrom owing to bills unpaid, then cheap lodgings and visits to the pawnbroker, then appealing letters to old uncle, all of which were returned unopened. Lastly, in the miserable tenement in Mulberry Street, we find them without sixpence, laughing in the face of starvation. What wonders will not youth and hope work? What horrible witches fly affrighted at its merry laugh, piercing as the clarion of the cock? Midas should have been the god of youth, for he turned everything to gold. After a pause in the merry talk of this young couple, which I took advantage of in order to relate all I knew of their history, Dick said suddenly, as if the conviction forced itself on him for the first time, "Do you know, Agnes, that I feel absolutely hungry?"
"No, do you, though?"
said Agnes, with the most comic air of surprise.
"Let us hasten up dinner."
"Certainly," answered Dick, falling instinctively in with her humor. "This cook of ours is confoundedly slow today. I shall give her a warning." And he made a feint of looking at his watch.
"I will ring the bell and tell John to hurry her," said Agnes, pulling an imaginary bell-rope. "John," she continued after a pause sufficient to allow the mythical John to mount the stairs, "John, tell the cook to send up the dinner instantly. Master is very angry at the delay."
"Yes, ma'am," replied a gruff voice, which Agnes, of course, did not affect to consider as proceeding from the bottom of Dick's chest. Then Agnes and her husband talked of indifferent matters for a moment or two, as if beguiling the weary time before dinner. After a proper period of delay, John's gruff voice announced dinner in the same mysterious manner as before. Then Dick made a great show of giving Agnes his arm and leading her in state into the dining-room. This solemn procession, however, consisted in marching round the naked chamber a couple of times, and bringing up before the old deal table, which was supposed to be loaded with all the delicacies of the season. Dick was agreeably surprised at the splendor of the repast. "What!" he exclaimed, seating himself on the old wine-box and glancing over the bare table. "What a sumptuous feast! I shall enjoy it. My appetite is splendid. John, remove the cover from the soup. This is potage à la reine, my dear. Excellent, if I may judge by the odor. Shall I send you some?"
"Thank you, dear,"
answered Agnes, receiving a supposititious soup-plate from the mythical John.
"It is delicious, but oh, I do declare I've burned my mouth. It is so hot."
And Agnes went through all the spasms of a person suffering from a spoonful of hot soup. "As I live, a salmon!" exclaimed Dick, starting into an attitude of surprise. "It is early in the season for such fish."
"It was sent from Scotland in ice," replied Agnes.
"It is a noble animal," said Dick, using an aerial fish-knife with wonderful dexterity. "There is no sport more magnificent than that of salmon fishing, particularly on the Scotch and Irish rivers. The noble scenery, the rapid river, the long lithe rod, the whizzing line that drops the gorgeous fly into the deep pool where the silver-sided rascals lurk. Then the strike, the quick whirring of the wheel, the flashing leaps of the captive, the moments of agony when the line slackens as he runs upstream, the joy when he pulls again, the breathless anxiety when the gaff is thrust under him as he swims, the deep sigh of relief when he is hauled, flapping, shining, bleeding, dying into the boat. All this is—"
"Very eloquent, no doubt," says Agnes. "But your salmon is cooling all this time, my dear husband."
"Ah, true!" cries Dick with a sudden start, and applying himself with instant vigor to the discussion of a supposed cut of rosy flesh, with mealy flakes of white lying in the crevices of the meat. "What a delicious salmon! We are indebted to our noble friend in Scotland."
"You will find this turbot de volaille aux truffes very excellent," said Agnes, peering with the air of a connoisseur at the ideal dish before her. "Francois's last master says that he is celebrated for it."
"We will see," muttered Dick, pursing up his lips and leaning back as far as he could on the wine-box, with a critical importance. "Good heavens, Agnes!" he exclaimed the moment after, with an air of horror. "How could you recommend this? Why, the fellow has not put a single coxcomb in it. Pshaw! Here, John, take this away, and tell Francois if he sends up a dish of that kind again, I will condemn him to eat it."
"Fortunately, there are some delicious côtelettes à la financière left, so we can dispense with the volaille," said Agnes.
"They are indeed excellent," answers Dick, making believe that his mouth is full of the succulent meat of the côtelette. So on through the whole of this strange repast. Delicacy after delicacy was announced. Some relished, others criticized, more dismissed indignantly. The unlucky Francois came in for many severe rebukes, transmitted through the mythical John. The game was pronounced overdone, and an English pheasant, a present from an illustrious British friend, was condemned as having been utterly spoiled in the dressing. The dessert, however, consisted of a soufflé and a delicious confection called gâteau égyptien, was solemnly pronounced to be perfect, and John was commissioned to convey a flattering compliment to Francois, as a salve for the rebukes given during the previous courses. Two children playing at feasting could not have conducted this visionary repast more earnestly. The correct wines were drunk at the correct moment, and all the little ceremonies of a formal diner scrupulously performed. When all was over, when the coffee had been served and drunk, when the table had been cleared away, and John had respectfully retired, the eyes of the young couple met, and a flash of laughter sprang from the encounter. Casting aside the elegant formality of the great lady en grande tenue, Agnes ran to her husband, and clasping him round the neck, fairly sobbed out her laughter on his breast. "Do you know, dear," said Dick after a little while, "it may entail on me the reputation of being a glutton, of having a wolf in my stomach, of being a vampire, or 1,000 other unpleasant reports, but I nevertheless cannot help confessing that I feel rather more hungry than I did before I commenced that exquisite dinner, which, in spite of some failures, does Francois infinite credit."
"Would you like to dine over again, Dick?"
inquired his wife with a grave air.
"Nothing is easier, you know."
"Certainly," answered Dick dubiously. "Nothing is easier, but I'm rather afraid that my tastes are becoming somewhat coarse. I am really ashamed of the very idea, but the fact is that at this very moment I have an intense longing for a piece of roast beef."
"That is singular," said Agnes with an air of surprise. "However, nature sometimes avenges itself on luxury by afflicting her votaries with homely tastes. I really pity you, Dick. For my part, nothing less delicate than a reed bird, tender, succulent, melting. An epitome, in fact, of perfume, nourishment, and flavor. Nothing less than this could possibly tempt my pampered appetite."
"I declare, Agnes," cried Dick, "I have a fancy just now to behave like a poor devil who hasn't got a penny. Yes, you may shrug your shoulders, but I really wish to divest myself of my splendor, and commit an act that contradicts the magnificence with which we are surrounded."
"Explain yourself."
"You remember that magnificent edition of Erasmus which my old friend Harry Waters gave me when I was going abroad? Well, I cherish that book dearly for the sake of him, and the few affectionate lines he has written on the flyleaf. Now, if a very poor man had that book, he would sell it, if he had nothing else to dispose of, for it is clasped with silver and is worth something. So I, who wish merely for a freak to experience the sensations of a poor man, have an idea of going out and selling that book, merely for the sake of the illusion, you know. Nothing more, on my honor."
"You always had queer fancies, dear," answered Agnes, as unconcernedly as if she had millions in her purse. But one might see beneath all that careless gaiety a sudden flash of hope sparkle for an instant. One could see very plainly that this book, which doubtless had till then been forgotten, gave her a new lease of life. One could see very plainly how bravely she had been smiling in the face of hunger and of death.
"Let me perform the last act of the millionaire before I play the part of a beggar," said Dick, rising joyously from his wine-box. "Sardanapalus burned his furniture. Why should I not consume my chairs? The fire is going out in a most unaccountable manner. Let us see how this fauteuil will blaze." So saying, he broke the wine-box into fragments and cast it into the almost fireless grate. The wine-box blazed. A lofty, ruddy flame sprang up in the fireplace, and shed a glow over the cold, naked room. It seemed as if the purple burgundy that once had lain between these few boards had left some portion of its fiery heart behind it. Who knows but that a bottle of that glowing wine was at that very moment sparkling on some splendid table? That in some other hemisphere the curtains were drawn close, and the wax lights blazing, and a party of jolly fellows with legs well stretched under the shining mahogany were toasting beautiful women, while the case which held the precious juice they were quaffing, the shell from which the soul that they were inhaling had fled, was burning in a rusty grate, and making a bonfire to scare away the werewolf, Death.
"The blaze is really quite cheerful," said Agnes, warming her hands, while a faint glow of pleasure spread itself over her face. "Do you know that I think a wood fire preferable to all others?"
"It recalls the feudal times," answered Dick. "We are in a vast baronial hall. The roof is solid, with ribs of blackened oak, and antlers hang from the walls, to each horn of which cling 1,000 memories of the chase. The floor is of solid stone. Old tattered banners droop from the walls, and wave heavily as if too weak with age to shake off the thickening dust that soils their historic splendor. No modern garments shroud our limbs. You, dearest, are clad in a lustrous cramoisi velvet, with peaked stomacher and stately train sweeping on the ground. A cavalier's hat with its trailing feather droops over my temples. My sword clings against the pavement, and I assume a picturesque and haughty attitude as I stand with my back to the wide fireplace, where huge logs of oak, supported by iron dogs, spit and blaze, and send streams of sparkles up the huge chimney. I am at present meditating whether Hubert the seneschal shall be beheaded or not. Shall I order his instant execution, or—
"Sell the book?" interrupted Agnes. please yourself."
"By Jove, I forgot," said Dick, forgetting in a moment all his splendor and feudality. "Agnes, I'll be back in 5 minutes. Tell John to prepare tea, and let us have the savoir service." And he bolted down the crazy stairs, reaching the bottom in a few bounds. Agnes smiled sorrowfully as she crouched over the rapidly sinking fire. The wine-box was fast losing its fiery spirit, and degenerating into a dull mass of blackening embers. Now that her joyous young husband was away, she had no one with whom she could laugh at misery. It takes two to fight that crawling, cruel monster. The moment the echoes of Dick's footsteps had died away, the horror laid its cold hand upon her heart. It was in vain that she'd tried to sing, to laugh, to conjure up those comical visions which she and Dick had used so often before as an exorcism. She felt a black wall, as it were, closing gradually round her. The air became too thick to breathe. The last bit of sky was gradually being shut off. Then a quick foot on the stairs, a merry cricket-like voice, a half-sung carol, and Dick burst into the room performing a species of triumphal dance. A piece of paper fluttered in his hand. $2, he cried, executing an indescribable figure. "Going for $2, this splendid, magnificent, delicious, succulent book with silver facings like a militia officer going for $2. Who'll bid? Only $2 gone at $2.
"You don't mean to say,"
said Agnes, rising eagerly. "I do. I absolutely got $2 for the book. 'Twas worth 15, but then you know we must not be too nice. Isn't it splendid?" And he waved the $2 bill as a young ensign waves his standard in the battle. "I brought it home, Agnes dear, because I think you are the best person to spend it. These wretches of tradespeople would certainly cheat me if I attempted to buy any eatables. What shall it be?"
"What do you think of sausages?"
said Agnes, suggesting rather timidly.
"They are cheap and—"
"Excellent!" cried Dick with a new pirouette. "Charming! I adore the sausage. Sausage with some nice white bread, a pat of butter, and a few apples, and we shall feast in dazzling splendor."
"Not forgetting a cigar for Dick?"
whispered Agnes, looking up lovingly in his face.
"I know that you long for a cigar."
"Angel!" cried Dick, clasping her in his arms and waltzing round the room with her. "There are no soundings to the depths of a woman's love."
"I'm off to the market, love,"
said Agnes, giving him a kiss. But this chaste salute was suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door. Both hearts leaped. Who could it be? A new misfortune? The bookseller where Dick sold the book seemed suspicious about his being in possession of such property. Heaven grant that nothing unpleasant threatened, was the prayer of the young couple. "Does Mr. Bardoon live here?" said a very deep, gruff voice. "Yes," said Dick boldly. "Come in." A short, thick-set man in a great coat entered and stood near the door. It was a dusky twilight in the room. The Assyrian bonfire of the wine-box had just expired in a few convulsive sparkles, and it was in vain that Dick tried to see the stranger's countenance. "Are you Mr. Bardoon?" asked the visitor. "I am," answered Dick. "What is your business, sir? I would ask you to be seated, but unfortunately all my furniture is packed up." "Never mind," answered the man gruffly. "You sold a book a short time since at Mr. Marble's bookstore, did you not?" "I really am not aware, sir," said Dick haughtily, "that this is any one's business but my own." "Softly, softly, my friend," answered the newcomer. "No need of quarreling. How did that book come into your possession?" "Are you a police officer?" inquired Dick in a menacing tone. "Never mind," said the man. "Answer my question first." "When I have answered it, I shall kick you downstairs, my friend." "I'll run the risk," said the fellow with a short laugh. "Well, then, it was given to me by a friend," answered Dick, making an ominous step toward the intruder. "Wait a moment. Don't kick me down the stairs just yet. Why did you part with that book?" "Curse you, that's none of your business," cried Dick savagely. "If you value your bones, you'll leave me." "I don't value my bones, so I'll stay until you have answered me," said the man very quietly. Dick could not help smiling at this audacity. "Every question I answer," said he, "I shall give you an additional kick for. You know the terms. Ask away." "Why did you part with that book?" "Because I was starving. Because I saw my wife fainting and dying of cold and hunger before my eyes, all the time with a brave smile upon her lips. Because I have sought for work and could not get it. Because there was neither food nor fire nor furniture in this wretched hole. Because starvation was flapping his wings like a vulture, hoping each moment to plunge his beak into our vitals. For these reasons I sold the book that dear old Harry Waters gave me, and for none other would I have profaned his gift. Now I have exposed my misery to you, sir, whoever you are, and you shall pay dearly for it. I will break every bone in your body. And he sprang like a tiger at the short, thick-set man who stood in the gloom. He felt himself suddenly seized by the shoulder and rooted to the earth as if he had been in the grip of an enormous vice. "Dick Burdoon," said the thick-set man, and this time his voice was sweet and soft as a woman's. "You are not going to kick me, Dick Burdoon. For many a starlit night in the silent fields you have lain with my arms around you and your head upon my bosom, while we talked of the splendid things we would achieve when we two went out into life hand in hand." Dick trembled like a leaf and said not a word. "You will not kick me, Dick Burdoon," went on the thick-set man, loosening his grasp of Dick's shoulder and drawing closer as he spoke, "because one day when the sun was pitiless and the river cool, a young weak boy, tempted by the clear waters, ventured into a deep part and went down, and then his friend, older and stronger than himself, plunged in, determined to rescue that fair boy or perish with him. And he dived into the deep waters twice, and the second time he found him, clasped in the meshes of loathsome weeds, with the merciless river sweeping away his young life. The elder boy struggled with him to land, and when they reached the shore people could scarce tell the saver from the saved. But when both recovered their strength and speech, the younger boy swore eternal gratitude to his preserver, and they vowed to be friends for evermore." "I remember! Cried Dick sobbingly. "Since that time," continued the thick-set man, "their paths in life have lain asunder, but I know that in the hearts of both old friendship lives still, and that if one of the twain were frowned on by the world, the other would pour out his life in smiles to make it sunshine with him again. That is why I know that you will not kick me, Dick Burdoon." "Harry Waters? My dear, dear old boy!" cried Dick through his tears, and flinging himself into the visitor's arms. "God bless you for coming, Harry, for I needed you sorely." "I saw you, my boy," said Harry, folding him in an embrace so gentle that one would imagine he was fondling a child. "I saw you the moment you entered the shop. You know I was always famous for poking in old bookstores, and I'm glad I have such tastes. I saw you selling the old Erasmus, my boy, and knew that something must be wrong with you. I followed you here, and now we three are joined, thank God, for a long time to come." And the kind fellow took poor timid Agnes's hand, and drew her close, till all three were united in one fond trinity of love. Need I tell how Harry Waters, the rich bachelor, carried Agnes and Dick off that evening to his house, and made much of them there? Need I say how they lived with him until Dick got employment, from which he has gradually raised himself to be a great merchant? Need I tell you about that solemn christening, whereat Dick's firstborn was named, with much ceremony, Harry Waters Burdoon? A hint of all those happy days will, I am sure, be enough for the warm-hearted reader, who has long since, I know, wished the young couple a full meal. One thing I must relate, however, an incident that occurred on the evening after the sale of the Erasmus. When the sobbings and the embraces were all over, Harry Waters, by way of saying something general, said to Dick, "By the way, have you dined yet?" Dick turned to his wife, who smiled. "Oh, yes, we dined sumptuously an hour ago," said Dick. "Ah, indeed," said Harry, rather surprised. "Yes, we dined with Duke Humphrey." End of section 11.